Welcome to you all this morning. My name is Chris Wolf. I am the president of the American Public Philosophy Institute, which is a group that tries to promote a natural law public philosophy consistent with the principles of the American founding especially. And we've been in Dallas since 2014. It's an independent 501c3 that's located at the University of Dallas. We sponsor various activities at the University of Dallas for students and faculty, and also for local business and professional leaders like yourselves. And today we're very fortunate to have with us Michael Pakaluk, who is Associate Dean and Professor at the Catholic University of America Busch School of Business and Economics. Michael has held positions at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, full professor at the Institute for Psychological Sciences outside of Washington, and at Ave Maria University before he went to Catholic University of America. He's also served as a visiting scholar at St. Andrews in Scotland and at Cambridge and at Santa Croce in Rome, so he's a world traveler. And his expertise is especially in ancient philosophy. He's written 3 or 4 books on Aristotle and Aristotelian ethics. He's also done books on natural law. But he also has a subspecialty in accounting ethics as well, and in fact gave a seminar to the Financial Accounting Standards Board 1 year. So he spoke last night at University of Dallas on the foundations of natural law. And so this morning he's pivoting, as they say these days, to give a talk on living professional ethics in a world of scandal. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much for that welcome, and I'm very pleased to be here. It's wonderful to be back in Dallas. I've enjoyed my stay so far. My wife and I arrived, and we took our 18-month-old with us because she does a lot of traveling too, and we always like for one of us to be at home, but if we're both traveling, we decide, well, we'll take him along, and that has its problems. We had a huge trolley of luggage, most of which could be attributed to the 18-month-old, and he doesn't take naps on the airplane. So there's so many things I could say about this topic. It's one of those broad topics that I probably picked because I could say 10 different things about it if I wanted. And you're confronting questions of ethics every day, I think. And my apologies if I don't touch upon something that's really close to you at the moment. I hope I can say something that's of general interest and maybe lead to some interesting questions and answers. Maybe you saw a couple of months ago something that was very interesting to me as somebody who works in accounting ethics, the scandal at KPMG in relationship to the PCAOB. The KPMG is a Big Four auditor. PCAOB is the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, which was created by Sarbanes-Oxley. And every year it inspects the audits of the Big Four and a few other firms too. And every 3 years it inspects the audits of any auditor who's auditing a registered public company. And it inspects not in a random fashion, but in a kind of targeted fashion. It picks items that are likely to be complex or subjective or difficult to understand or interpret, or new rules and regulations, and drills down in particular audits. So a Big Four firm might be auditing 900 issuers, and it will pick maybe 50 or 60 of these audits to inspect. So from the point of view of the audit firm, it'd be very nice to know, right, what the PCAOB plans to do in the years coming audits. Well, in fact, KPMG recruited an inspector from the PCAOB, someone who had been the head of inspections for KPMG's audits. And they recruited him specifically, or the partner at KPMG recruited him specifically to give this kind of secret information about what audits the PCAOB was planning to look at and what issues it was going to drill down on. And he had some friends back at the PCAOB who were also still there and continuing to feed him information, and they actually recruited one of these other persons too eventually. All right, so this came out because after this was kind of floated to about 70 partners within KPMG, one of them finally kind of went to the best practices, the ethics compliance person inside KPMG, and the whistle was blown, and the SEC eventually came onto it, and these people were fired, and enforcement actions have begun against them. But when this news came out, the thought, I know, of friends in the profession and to look at this kind of thing was, well, who's surprised? Right? We're dealing with a general culture, in our view, of universities, academic institutions, perhaps society at large, where cheating is widespread, taken for granted, and frequently not punished. So why should anyone be surprised it's now breaking out the highest levels of professional life? This, we don't know, but the person who was hired from the PCAOB to KPMG who could be surprised that this person was cheating in graduate school, cheating in college, cheating in high school before that. So studies have been done, and it's something like 70% of students cheat in high school. College, the figure goes a little bit larger because more people get recruited, so to speak, to the cheating business, and you would expect then that if these people go on to professional school, they're not going to stop cheating all of a sudden. It's showing up in scientific studies, data that's manufactured, experiments that can't be replicated. Okay, so I want to say something eventually about my efforts as Associate Dean at the Catholic University of Mary to deal with academic dishonesty. But I want to raise the question of can ethics be taught? Right, so at what point in someone's life, if you bring them aboard, do you have to kind of give up on the possibility that you're going to be able to change them? Right, so you want to be more interested in selection rather than any kind of culture or any kind of reinforcement or instruction or mentoring. You just have to select. Right, when does that happen? Is that college level? Is that first job? The family, just something which is obvious but it's worth saying, has huge advantages when it comes to teaching ethics. To see this, it's necessary to make a distinction between two kinds of virtues. This is a distinction that Aristotle made and was followed throughout the tradition. There are intellectual virtues and there are so-called moral virtues. Moral virtues, you might say, well, can there be immoral virtues? And of course, there are virtues are moral. Moral virtues have to do with character. It's from the Latin word for character, custom, morus. So a moral virtue is a virtue that affects your character, your feelings, your intuitions. I was talking with someone before. We sat down to eat about the deepest things that are in your heart, and you call them intuitive, and that you're yearning for and longing for, what you approve of, what you disapprove of, everything that's effective, everything that's striving or tending towards something, that has to do with our character. The intellect merely sees that things are so. Now, intellectual virtue would be something like technical competence. So you could teach technical competence, for example, in auditing, in the classroom. It has to be put into practice, of course, but the basics of it can be taught in the classroom. Anything you can teach in the classroom is an intellectual virtue. There's a huge mistake in our society of taking all virtue to be in principle intellectual virtue. All right, so what was the response, for example, in the accounting area after Enron and WorldCom? Mandatory classes in ethics for all CPAs in order to get relicensed every 2 years. All right, so the presumption that taking a class is going to address the problem. And that would be true only if the failures involved in WorldCom and Enron involved intellectual virtue. Now, intellectual virtue is interesting because it's not a real virtue. You find this again in the tradition. It's not a virtue in the full sense of the word. A virtue in the full sense of the word makes somebody good and makes them such that they, on their own and spontaneously, do the right thing. It, in some mysterious way, also instills the correct motives. So, for example, a very clear example of a moral virtue, courage. If you have the virtue of courage, it's not simply that you're capable of doing the right thing in battle, it's that you want to do the right thing in battle. You want to be bold when you should be bold. You want to be cautious when you should be cautious. You wouldn't be happy if you were injured and taken away from the front lines, right? It changes what you want, what you're striving for. And that makes it a real virtue, because virtue has to do with actions. So real virtue makes you act in predictable ways. Right? And intellectual virtue simply makes you capable of doing that. So you might know how to do this. So if you study accounting ethics, you might know what the ethical thing to do would be in a certain circumstance. That, in turn, could lead you to game the system better and more effectively, or and be used badly, or can be used well. So we could roughly say, when we get to the point where the only thing that we can basically do in dealing with someone is give them a class or instruction, then we've reached the point where we can no longer impart moral virtue, but only intellectual virtue. Right? And is that college already? Is that all we can do? You may have heard the phrase in loco parentis. Sometime in the 60s, colleges in general gave up on the idea that they were standing in the place of parents in dealing with children. They rejected the idea of in loco parentis, and they regarded themselves as generally not having any kind of paternalistic role towards students. Right? So at that point, do they become more or less incapable of imparting more virtue, or do they still try to do so in different ways? Right? Well, certainly you can, I know, in higher education through expecting academic honesty out of students. So the whole kind of realm. Generally, you can't impart moral virtue without requiring action and then punishing and rewarding either failures or following through with actions. The two advantages that the family enjoys in this regard are, let's say three. First, a domain of punishment, right? So whatever it is, it's time out, or you miss a meal, or you get spanked, there's a regimen of real and immediate punishment which is available to parents in a family, which I guess nuns in schools used to have, at least all the other stories say that, but corporal punishment or any kind of effective and immediate punishment is very hard to apply. Even, say, with academic dishonesty in the classroom, there's so many different levels of review and analysis that if anyone ever gets punished in the end, it's going to be weeks, months after the thing was done. Chris, how long should I go to? 8:20, okay. And we have Q&A after that, all right. I went 15 minutes over my time last night because I made a major miscalculation in how quickly I read. Yeah, right, I shouldn't do that at this point in my life, but I did. So that's one advantage, the ability to apply punishment and reward really quickly, almost immediately in the household. The other is vigilance, being able to watch carefully what actions would normally remain hidden or secret. So, and to be unyielding about certain things for a certain period of time. I'll give you an example. My eldest son, Joe, had an issue 3-4 years ago. He's 17. He had an issue 3 or 4 years ago with truthfulness. Maybe because he's a clever boy, but nothing ever came out straight from his mouth. Especially things that he did, he misdescribed or redescribed and never really admitted anything, and it was kind of an implicit self-deception and deviousness, and which we all suffer from. Of course, it's part of human nature. But it's particularly bad for him, and we all saw it. And he'd do something, and he'd deny it right in front of everybody. Or I didn't do that, I did this, and it was patent to everybody in the family that he was somehow not getting it straight. He was lying. I don't think he even knew it. Right? He didn't even know it. And in our relativistic world, I could imagine a situation where no one was in loco parentis. Somebody might say, okay, well, you see things that way, we see things in a different way. And you'd even begin by the premise of allowing him, so to speak, the right to his initial subjective assessment of what he did. Right? As a father, I thought that was not acceptable at all. I viewed my role as pounding into him the correct way of viewing what he had done. And so there was a kind of extreme vigilance. It's like the drill sergeant was assigned to Joseph for a summer, and he was carefully watched for every incident where he would have the opportunity to be truthful or not. And, Pouncip, I think once I did tackle him I just lost my patience, and I tackled him, and I said, "That's not correct." And we were lying there on the kitchen floor, and I looked him in the face, and I said, "You will tell the truth." Okay, so that's the second advantage the families have, which is this vigilance. And the third is love and admiration, right? Maybe despite of, or even sometimes because of, this kind of care for character. And you know from your own lives that your children hate this. We hate it, but then they also love you for it, right? They understand that it's a sign of love, that you care that much. You're not doing the easy thing. And this is important because there's always the issue of the change in motive. When a moral virtue is being imparted, an action is being required not because the person who does it wants to do it. If they did, they would have the moral virtue. They do it because they're being threatened with punishment if they don't do it. They're being told they have to do it. A command is given, a law is given, they have to comply with it. They're doing it out of fear. Now, when someone acts out of fear, they don't do the right thing, or they're very disposed not to do the right thing if they believe they won't be seen or won't be punished if they are seen. Right? Somebody once said, virtue is doing what's right even when you're not seen. Right? How do you get somebody to do what's right when they're not seen? They have to love doing what's right. How do you get them to love what's right? They do have to change from doing what's right way back when at some point because they had to and they would have been punished, right, to doing what's right because they love to do what's right. What affects that mysterious change? Well, again, there may be many paths to this, but the family has a kind of natural path to this, which is love and admiration. Children love and admire their parents and want to become like them, and so they want to imitate also what their parents love. There's this literary critic, René Girard, who wrote about what he called the imitation of desire. He said almost all desire was imitative, that we actually don't on our own make up what we want to want, that we take our wants from what other people want. And this very clearly happens within the household. All right, so you have those three things. You have the ability to apply punishments and rewards almost immediately, and corporeal ones, which are appropriate for some sorts of things, I believe. Things that are more animal-like should be dealt with in a more animal manner. You have vigilance and extreme surveillance, the possibility of that. And you also have this possibility of the transference or change of motive based on love and affection, right? And that doesn't really exist very easily outside of the family. Commonly it does for athletic coaches. This is well known, right? And also pastors, sometimes teachers, when they're looked at as mentors rather than simply instructors, and mentors within the workplace. Right? In some firms, the CEO, the founder, is loved and respected and admired in that way, and there's kind of a character that's imparted to the entire culture of the company that emanates from that person. And that's paternal, it really is, or maternal, as the case may be. So this is the point, maybe the main thing I want to say, that there's not an endless possibility of teaching moral virtue to people. And we're living in a society probably where it's getting neglected on a fairly wide scale in families and in schools before people reach maturity, which creates a certain kind of problem. I do want to say, however, that I don't write people off and never would, and no one should, of course, because the seeds of virtue, I believe, that's a classical phrase, are present in everyone. A good example would be, remember after 9/11, how everybody, it seemed, made some kind of resolution about what they were going to do differently in their lives. I'm not going to do this any longer. I'm not going to put this kind of misguided weight on this thing, right? It's as though they all knew, well, if I were going to die tomorrow, there's going to be some kind of reckoning, or if I look at what's really important, I can kind of figure out what that is. I actually kind of know what that is, right? Or as the French moralist de Rochefoucauld said, he said that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue, right? The fact that people are hypocrites show that within them is a sense of what the right thing to do would be, right? They're not shameless. So the seeds of virtue do remain, right? So maybe that's the question that then is practically posed to us. If we're dealing with mature men and women who are employees or potential hires, how do we deal with them in relation to this question that probably virtue and character formation has already taken place? And I do think that selection is the most important thing. So to my mind, the most successful business people I know make what they call hiring on mission, and they take that to be a kind of general judgment about how someone's personality and character relates to the most important goals of an enterprise. Right? They take hiring on mission to be the absolute most important criterion in making a hiring decision, and they find that people can be trained and they'll learn what they need to learn, but that's the crucial thing. You want people of their own accord to choose what you would choose. That's the problem, right? Not because they're being surveilled or any other reason. You want them of their own accord to do that, and that's a matter of character. Now, what can you do, though, to reinforce? I want to give you an analogy, and I'm just going to throw this out, and this will probably be the last thing I'm going to say. How to deal with academic dishonesty. I'm going to take as an analogy from something I'm dealing with right now as an associate dean. What happens in the academy is that professors tend to be fairly strict about academic dishonesty because they do inevitably adopt a kind of paternal or maternal role in the classroom, or at very least an attitude of friend, and they feel personally hurt and betrayed when a student engages in academic dishonesty. It's an act of betrayal. It's an act of abusing trust. And professors also keenly aware of, so to speak, fairness in assigning grades. If you give somebody a C and someone else a B, right, you do that because there's a difference in their work, and it would not be fair to give that B to the student who really deserves a C. So because professors are always making these decisions in justice about the assignment of grades, they're keenly aware of the injustice of academic dishonesty. So if you can kind of let professors make the call, then everything would be fine. And actually the handbook of my university is very good in this regard. It lets the professor assess whether academic dishonesty has taken place, assign a punishment, and the default punishment is failure in the course. And then all the professor has to do is report to the dean the decision. There's no level of the dean doesn't have to approve. There is a process of appeal where the dean may be brought in if the student decides to appeal, but the dean may also dismiss the appeal as frivolous and without merit, in which case there's a further review of the dean's decision. Nonetheless, the point is that, so to speak, in the court of hearing is the professor. It's not any dean. And I think this is very good because it's a good system. It just needs to be implemented correctly. Because what happens throughout all of academia is that professors want to punish students for academic dishonesty, and they're undermined by deans who are looking at figures of retention, tuition dollars, and so on, and they don't want to deal with parents who are going to come to them and complain. And they don't have the same feelings of injustice and betrayal that the professors have, so they capitulate very easily. But here's my analogy for you. So, I was an undergraduate once, and it was a fairly long time ago now. And when I was an undergraduate, I'll tell you, I went to Harvard College, and there's a friend of mine who says you can always tell a Harvard man, he'll let you know he went to Harvard within the first 5 minutes of meeting him. And there was a story going around, looking back, I'm not sure it was true, but everybody believed it was true. There was a student who, in her senior year, she had an attack of senioritis, didn't really feel like doing work for a certain spell of time, for a certain course, and just bought a paper, plagiarized a paper, reused someone else's paper for the final paper in one of her courses. And this was discovered And she was punished not by failure in the course, which is regarded today as a very severe punishment for academic dishonesty, but by expungement from the university. This was understood to be a technical term that was used at Harvard College and no other place, because we were very good because we were that strict, right? So the student was actually expelled from the university, according to the story, and expunged, which meant that somebody went back through all the records of Harvard and removed her name from all of the records, so that it was as if she had never even been there. Now, and nobody took that to be surprising. And everybody thought, well, okay, she cheated, right? She shouldn't have done that. I would never have done that. None of my friends would ever have done that, right? You know, back in that day, nobody wrote on the syllabus what the procedures and policies were for academic dishonesty. Right, today, I mandate as associate dean that they be included in every syllabus, and the professor at the first day of class go over these things with the students. It didn't have to be done then. And I wonder why it didn't have to be done. And there are all kinds of intangibles that play into it. You know, at a place like Haverford College, there's a long-standing code of honor. I know that BYU has a very strong honor code. These are cultures that are very special and rare, and they're very important to preserve when we find them. But something else that I think is important is the change in how studies are understood. So since I was in college, there's been a tremendous change, even in places like Harvard College, Amherst, Williams, which do not have pre-professional classes on principle, towards thinking of education as a matter of utility, advancement. Right, so maybe you've heard the theory of signaling. Right, this is actually E. Michael Spence, who was a dean at Harvard, an economist at Harvard, and I knew him when I was a graduate student there. Did he win the Nobel Prize for his theory of signaling? Anyway, it's his theory, and it's very, very well received. But his view is that what grades do in college is not correspond to the merit of the work, but they signal to potential employers that the students have certain capabilities that would make them hard and effective workers in the firm they're going to be hired into. And of course, we know about the return on investment, on educational dollars, the emphasis now on STEM, the turning towards professional schools. Like I'm at a professional school at the Catholic University of America, where historically theology and philosophy were very strong, and church history, but the fastest growing unit of the university is the business school. Right? And you have a lot of very decent young men and women who think that if they do not go into business, they're somehow doing something irresponsible in college. So the whole nature of college education has changed to, what are you going to do with that? What are you going to get out of it? How are you going to improve your earnings after you leave college? That's the fund. I want to say something like a fund. Again, we were talking before this meeting about fundamental presupposition. It kind of colors how students look at everything. And if that's the way that you look at everything, then, okay, let's say this. At least there's a contrast between another way of looking at things. So let me just explain the other way of looking at it to you. The other way of looking at it to you is that the human race as a whole has a vocation and responsibility to know about the world. I don't know if you've ever heard those words before, but they're interesting and they're true. All right, so we have a kind of natural vocation to know. And it can't really be carried out by anyone individually. It has to be carried out corporately. This has to be a corporate effort through the assignment of different areas of knowledge to different experts. And that's what a university is in principle. A university in principle is a corporation with specialization, whereby corporately some people are doing for us the work which we're all supposed to do in a certain sense, because we have the gift of reason, of knowing about the world. And in this corporate endeavor, because specialization is so important, and I can't figure out the reasons for someone else's work. So a scientist tells me, well, this proves that so-and-so is the case, say a mathematician. I actually cannot do the proof myself. I'm saying this as a matter of fact. I'm pretty smart, and I love math, and I've studied math. But probably most of the things that a Harvard math professor proving, I would have to spend years to try to figure out to understand. So in an environment of specialization, credentialing and authority are highly important. Right? So when somebody says, well, this and such is true, and he's a scientist, she is a doctor, a mathematician, I don't ask, and the philosopher J.L. Austin pointed out, why is it true? I ask, how do you know that it's true? Right? The why question is a request for a rehearsal of all the reasons, and I'm not in a position to check those reasons. The how question is a request for credentials. What puts you in a position to make this judgment that's true? Well, I have my PhD from Stanford University in chemical engineering. Okay. So, because that is the vocation of the university and the structure of knowledge, someone who's part of a university and is, so to speak, playing that game, you are part of that world for 4 years. And you may, in fact, go on to graduate school and join that world. Right? But the fundamental law governing life in that world is one of honesty in the conveyance of information from others and in the sources of information. The trust and the authority, which is essential to the project, would be vitiated otherwise. Now, if that's your understanding of what you're doing there, academic dishonesty is so close to the goal, it's kind of written into the fabric of what you're doing. And it's so to speak, obvious in your day-to-day life that you wouldn't do this because it's fundamentally violative of what you're engaged in for those 4 years, even if you're a lowly sophomore in some introductory organic chemistry class, right? All right, so then this is my closing message to you. I'm convinced that in every realm of life there's some kind of similar question. There are pressures to change what you're doing in a utilitarian fashion so that they're reconceived in a functional, pragmatic, utilitarian way. And yet there are, let's say, intrinsic values in what you're doing, which are present and there to be pointed to and honored and given chief emphasis. Right? It may be, for example, the value added you think your business is providing, the good to society, the nature of the service, the standards of excellence that you hold yourself to. And you can use your imagination and come up with what's most relevant in your own circumstances. And I think it's important to be sure, right, that the very structure and culture of an enterprise is such that, right, what's intrinsically good about what you're doing is given emphasis. Right. Now, I'll just say one other thing about this. I think that that's very difficult to do without a liberal education, because a liberal education is an education where you actually spend your time devoted to looking at things which are intrinsically good, intrinsically true, intrinsically beautiful, just because they are so, apart from their use value. Right? So if you were to say, well, it's a good idea to put someone away for 2 years out in the country, or Irving, Texas, for example, and have them just devote all of their attention to things that are intrinsically valuable because they are intrinsically valuable. If we let loose hundreds and thousands of people like this into society afterwards, would that be a good thing, yes or no? Yes, it would. Right. So that is my message for this morning, that there are intrinsically good things that we want people to love, and that one of the things that we can do for adults who are beyond the role of character formation is to bring these out and honor them in the appropriate way in our areas of work. Thank you.
How do you do that?
I think it's a question that is different in different domains. So, for example, talk can help in setting out an ideal. So, for example, I consult for a data aggregating service in the auditing and accounting areas. And the founder and CEO has made it very clear that their product has to be accurate. Right? People buy a product which is accurate, and also looked at by a human being. So it's data that's been reviewed, and it has, therefore, a degree of reliability which goes beyond what a machine can do. All the best AI and machine intelligence is employed. Right? So, but the CE makes that clear. And there's no, I don't know, is it incentivized? Well, actually, I don't think the company is sort of sophisticated enough to do reliability checks that are related to work. But that's clear. So that's made part of the culture. So that the reliability and truthfulness of the data, apart from any kind of immediate financial remuneration, is made clear. So that's just one example. I think there are many analogies. Does that answer your question?
Next question is how you do that. Does the CEO talk, and that's what somehow communicates to people down throughout the company, that this is what he values, that this is what the company
Yes, I think so. I think that's part of leadership. These have to be kind of live and burning things for you, and that's conveyed to your VPs or your next level, and then that's transmitted down. Everybody's animated in the same way. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm not a management guy, but it seems to me that's the way it works.
Something you said is interesting, because I've been thinking about this recently. There's if you're familiar with Chris knows I can talk about this, but this phenomenon of Jordan Peterson.
Yes.
Right. So Jordan Peterson is this political psychology professor at the University of Toronto. He talks about, and it struck me when you said your comment about this girl getting expunged.
Yes.
From Harvard, and the comment of, well, I wouldn't do that, my friends wouldn't do that. Well, one of the things that Jordan Peterson talks about is his background studying ideology. How does a group of people?
The question was, how does a group of people go from a just political thought to an ideology, and the recognition that if someone says, oh, the in Nazi Germany, I wouldn't have been a Nazi, even though the reality is that you probably would have been, and that acknowledgement that you have that capability of evil within you. I then bring that to my very first career coming out of college was as an investment banker, and I was on the Enron team. And so some of the partnerships, LJM and LJM2 and some of these, I was the analyst that helped draft those offering memorandums.
Wow.
And what I remember from that was at no point in time was there this sense that you were in this evil group of people huddling together to defraud, right? It was, we're a smart group of people who have found a way to take advantage of an opportunity or a loophole in accounting, or it wasn't, it may have been for some of the people, but for at least what I observed, it was not kind of malintent. It was, financial ingenuity.
Yeah.
And so then I left the firm, and then a couple years later see my bosses testifying in front of Congress and guys that I knew that were sentenced to prison. And within that it was the first time that I realized that ethics and something that is portrayed as evil in media is not that far from you. It doesn't take much. And for you to, the step from you being a good business leader to being in prison is much, much smaller than you think it is.
Yeah.
And I guess as you were talking of, is that something that, like I said, I guess it kind of goes back to your answer on leadership, but the one answer would be, can you help form people in order to do that within your business that already exists, or is it something that you have to hire and find people who are willing to not just go up against that line, but take a step back and not even get close to that line, because that line is much closer than you think. it is.
Yes.
I don't know. I'm just kind of, this is what's going through my brain as you're.
Yeah, well, that's
as you're
an
talking.
interesting. So people think that Hitler is evil, and they probably have a false understanding of who Hitler is, and they're not really clear who else is evil. Maybe people who can be analogized to Hitler in one way or another, and they think of evil as being, as you said, malicious intent. And evil almost never has the form of malicious intent. Right? It has more the form of being thoughtless, not paying attention to something you should be looking at. Well, in the case you're talking about, the auditors, I think, are the ones who have the role of looking at the transaction and finding out whether that it accords actually with standing policy and is criminal or not. Wouldn't the auditors have that responsibility? So Anderson did have that responsibility in the case of Enron. I think that's right. So, but some of your colleagues in investment banking actually went to jail as well, or? Yeah. Wow. And do you think that there was criminal intent? Was there scienter, the attorneys would say?
It's hard to know. Again, I was a junior on the deal, so I didn't get to see
Yeah.
everything. But I mean, you know, not as much to be on here, but I'm not sure that some of the guys that got put in prison were smart enough to be evil in a sense, right? I mean, I think it was, you know, they're not the mastermind kind of people.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
The problem with your comment that the auditors would be responsible
Yes.
is way off base.
You think so?
Yes, because the process should work. The managers should be the ones responsible for knowing where those lines are. The idea is to push the line. I
Yes.
push lines as much as I could. But there's a line that goes from gray to black and white.
Yes.
And when you hit that black and white line, you ought to be talking to your own internal auditors. You ought to be honest and telling them what you're doing. In the Enron situation, it was, in simple language, we're not using loopholes, we're hiding assets. And if you said that to your auditors, they would have caught it there. The company's hiding it from the external auditors, and I'm not an auditor. I don't think it's their responsibility at all. They're there to catch the cheats. But it never should get to the point where they were cheating in the first place.
Yeah.
But I think you have a more interesting point too. So I think that's where we're talking about. What is the definition then? What becomes the definition of cheating at that point, right? So much like Rob, I've worked at a bank from like the first day guy that carries the bags to like actually making decisions and saying, guys, we're not doing this. It's a bad decision. And then have had management come in and overturn and say, well, yeah, but we're gonna make all this money on this thing. So we need you to be quiet for a little while, and then everything will be okay. And so, you know, it's the strength and the courage by the senior man. It's the strength and courage around at all levels, right? Of the junior guy, when, you know, Rob was working kind of the first structuring memos to say, man, that's tough, especially when and oftentimes the people that recognize this stuff are the lower level boots on the ground guys. And the structures that have been put in place, kind of with what you're talking about, it's now become in colleges where there's just kind of this perpetual appeals process of that if you're, you know, willing to bitch enough, somebody eventually high enough will be like, guys, that's just too hard, I don't want to deal with that. And then they overturn a good decision of a kind of the front line guy. That's my observation.
Let me ask this: intellectual virtue versus moral
virtue.
Virtue. Is intellectual virtue, by definition, incomplete, absent omniscience? In other words, without the moral component, the moral virtue component, you can easily make the mistakes of, as you said, evil is often lacking in knowledge as opposed to malicious. Is that sort of a dichotomy that we should focus on? In other words, everything's incomplete without the moral component, the moral virtue component.
Yeah. I think that's right. And you know, if you think about what's called due diligence, right? How do you know that you should look more, right? You might say that's more a matter of intuition, or your sense of risk or hazard, or what you think is at stake, or a certain kind of involvement or concern, right? And that's not an intellectual virtue.
Yeah, I had a question. I'm gonna make it a little more shallow where I'm comfortable. You guys are going too deep. I like answers. I read a lot of Cliff Notes at the University of Dallas. I fill out a lot of forms every year, banking forms, loan documents, licensure, and I always giggle when I get to the question, do you use illegal, illicit drugs? And I've told my wife, I'd love to hire the people that actually answer that truthfully, because I think that, I mean, we can fix that. So my question is, as I'm hiring people, and you're saying it's a selection process, are there any tools or anything that you can share that will help me in that process? Because my point is, in the interview, if I ask questions about ethics, they're clearly going to answer the way that they think that I want to.
Yeah.
When they see the vision of my company, the vision statement, they're going to understand where we come from, and so they're going to answer accordingly.
Yeah. Well, I think there are questions you can ask that you find out whether that's canned and contrived or whether it's truthful. I think you can look for recommendations, which have less weight now and authority than they used to have in the past, but you can look for those. I wonder if there aren't interviewing tests. Let me give you an example involving academic dishonesty. This is a real case, so everything, I'll keep the details confidential, but a professor in an ethics class was doing a short answer quiz and handed to one of the students by mistake the answer key. Right? Now, it's kind of a cool idea, right? I'm considering doing it in my own ethics class, deliberately, right? And the student held on to it for a while, and this is a barely passing student, and then handed it back and said, oh, you gave me the answer key, may I have a real quiz? Then handed in his quiz and got perfect score on the quiz. And the professor invited him to his office hours and gave slightly changed wording the same quiz, and the student couldn't get more than 4 or 5 out of 15, which in a multiple choice of 4 is chance. Well, that's part of honesty, right? Returning what isn't yours if it ends up in your lap. So, I bet there are interviewing techniques which can do something similar. I know the military and airlines and so on have interviewing techniques which test behavior under stress, for example. That's a very good question. I need to get down to that level and find out some answers to that question. Yes. I'm sorry. Did I skip your question? Okay.
Is on the selection.
I won't call in anyone for now on.
The selection versus classes debate, and if we go to mass weekly or church weekly, isn't that also part of that is a pastor or priest speaking for 20 minutes, and almost all of that is going to be on some moral choice. And I would like to think that is having a positive effect on me. And is there something that we could be learning from that, from Christ's model, to implement into the business? We're mostly businessmen here, or academic, to provide us that weekly reminder of how to make the right moral choices.
Yeah, I mean, it's common sense. Look, I think it's generally true that people who are devout are better than they would have been otherwise, right? So it's a fallacy to say therefore they become very good persons. That doesn't follow, but they're certainly going to be better. Why? As you say, somebody's devoting a substantial amount of time every day, every week, to reflecting on their own behavior and trying to improve it, and who believes that an omniscient God exists who sees what they do even when no human beings can see, right? And is going to judge them at the end of their lives. That is a huge, just common sense says, that's a huge incentive towards acting well. So somebody who believes those things is more likely to act well and is going to be improving ethically, where someone who doesn't, to that extent, is not going to be improving. However, again, the fallacy is that therefore you do become I think you're only entitled to conclude you're much better than you would have been.
If you're in your group and you're mandating classes, you're just trying to get the employees better than they would have been without the class.
Yeah.
And is the class going to be helpful or not? I guess that's,
Yeah.
by definition, almost addressing it is going to help the problem a little bit.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
So full disclosure, I'm at KPMG. So
Okay.
yeah, and we should talk later, by the way, because there's a paper to be written about this somewhere in Harvard Business Review or elsewhere. And to be clear, we're all pretty pissed off and disgusted about the whole thing. But and it goes to show what a couple of people can do to an otherwise good organization.
Yeah, ask Anderson, right?
Yeah, exactly. I was at Anderson too. I think it's following me. I didn't audit Enron though. So, and I'm not an auditor. So I'll just this sort of back to what Rob was doing, sort of swirling around my head. I do think we're at a collision course between our economic system and virtue, though. And I think if we go look at, and maybe we can spend some time together, I don't know, looking at that case, and I'll have to do it confidentially, of what happened with us. Certainly like to at least talk about it, because I'm trying to work it out in my own head. You had 2 or 3 people, one of whom used to be here in Dallas, so we know him well, who were otherwise thought to be poster children for doing the right thing. Their whole careers had never had an issue of any kind, and which is why they were put in that role. We had audit quality issues. What we also had were economic issues. They wanted to make more money off of an audit practice, and audits don't make money, by the way, in case anybody wonders. We don't make money on audit. No, I know. It is hard to believe, but the amount of work that is now required out of an audit is, and the public thinks that if you publish financial statements, they're down to the penny, right? Correct. They don't understand materiality and, none of that stuff. So, while fees may be high, they're not a place we're making a huge amount of money. And so the question was, how do you do more with less? How do you automate? And all of a sudden you take your eye off quality, and quality starts to slip, and then you've got to fix all these problems. And all of a sudden you've got a lot of pressure on people who otherwise were seen to be very ethical people. And so the question, back to, and I think we'd all like to expunge them if possible, so maybe we can talk to Harvard about how you do that. But back to the Nazi example, and I don't want to go that far with them, not making an analogy of them to the Nazis, but you can get to a point where people can no longer resist. And I don't know what was going through those guys' heads, and I don't claim to know them well, but it seems to me that our system, our economic system, and the way it's implemented and the way we're running it is not focused on virtue, to your last point. And we as business people are, people in this room probably try to do that more than anybody else in this town, or at least as an example of that, right? But there aren't very many, it feels like sometimes. And so the question is, how do you get the focus of business not just on what's the bottom line, but how did you get to the bottom line? Because ethics courses are, in my opinion, a waste. I mean, I do it every 2 years, and it's a total waste of my time. Because I'm going to do it anyway. It's not about that. You can't, to your point, you can't teach it. But you've got to fix the underlying system that puts people in a position of saying, either have to choose unethical behavior or my job or my family's well-being. And I'm sorry, this is a big, long commentary, but I think that may be the analysis when you come out the back end of it, is that you can put people in a position whereby it is not impossible to be ethical, but it gets very worse than very difficult, right? It gets you're in a box to the point where you have to make what would be otherwise, decisions that otherwise you would never even contemplate.
Okay, so this was the result of kind of pressure felt from a couple of inspection reports coming from the PCAOB involving KPMG, which were embarrassing to KPMG. It looked like quality was slipping, right? So is this one of these strange things where PCAOB overall is having a very good effect on audits because it's increasing their quality, but there are going to be occasional scandals, but it's not such a bad thing if the scandal is the form of somebody trying to steal the exam from the PCAOB. That's a much less important scandal for the American economy than another Enron or WorldCom.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it is the head-on collision between capitalism as currently operated and virtuous behavior. Because it is, I see it every day, even in what we do. I'm on the consulting side, but I see junior people say, well, wouldn't it be easier to just cut this corner to make more money on this job?
Yeah.
No, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
I don't care if we lose money on the job, we're going to do the job right.
Yeah.
If we did it wrong, it's our problem. It's our fault.
Yeah, my concern is that it's the older guys who are saying we can't do that, and I don't see.
I don't think everybody does.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I think there are a lot of older guys who would say, let's cut back on it, right? Unfortunately.
But then part of the problem becomes too is you then get washed out at some point, right? Like think of all the guys that were in your starting class.
Right.
There's 5% of them left. They got to the point that they were, and this is anything with like Rob, I started out in banking. There's not a lot of guys left. They have to go off other places. And I had a conversation with somebody kind of very recently about this, and it's not a personal statement on me saying, hey, I'm all virtuous and great and that. He's like, well, you know, you stay and do what you're doing because you're kind of in this behind enemy lines kind of perspective. And I was like, well, first of all, I'm not that important to the organization, so let's not go that way. But yeah, there is something in that. It gets harder and harder kind of every day as you kind of go up more and more to continue, and the pressures kind of come more and more. And just continual. I like what you talked about with the appeal process in the academic dishonesty. I mean, I see that more and more. It seems like there's a perpetual appeal process to undo like the right decision every single time.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm an accountant, but I don't have a question on auditors. As a philosopher, can you comment on the Me Too movement? Do you see that as a sort of net positive of, you know, really correcting bad behavior, or is it that may help corporations, or is this like a media buzz or blip? You know, how do you view that as a philosopher doing what you do?
Well, it seems to me it's something that's arisen because of the breakdown of standards of kind of chastity, I want to say, or I don't know if that's too harsh or strong a word, but a certain kind of, there used to be this term ladies and gentlemen, kind of having a mode of acting towards one another where we're appropriately dignified and self-possessed and show courtesy towards others. So I think when that's broken down as a result of the sexual revolution, then we get this kind of adversarial correction. So it's certainly good. I mean, what's being focused on is bad and ought to be expunged itself, but it has this contentious adversarial character, which is unfortunate because the proper culture is not there.